This is the moment the story begins. A bank manager takes a check for $10 million, rips it in half with a slow, deliberate pull, and then tosses the pieces at a man standing at the counter. The lobby goes quiet. Pieces of paper flutter onto polished shoes. A dozen customers, a security guard, the bank teller whose name tag reads Sarah Winters. All of them hold their breath. The image itself is the headline. The sound is small and terrible. The paper gives a thin, intimate tearing that somehow feels louder than the fluorescent hum above. For the man at the counter, the rip does more than destroy a piece of paper. It announces, in public and with witnesses, that he does not belong. The shocking moment, a bank manager destroyed a black man's $10 million check. Brandon Coleman had carried that paper in a briefcase that morning, like a talisman. The briefcase was worn at the corners, the leather softened by years of being opened and closed, and it had belonged to his father, Gerald, a man who had taught him how to stand straight, how to answer a room, how to keep your dignity when the world tried to tell you otherwise. Brandon had taken those lessons literally that day. He had dressed for the deposit in a suit that fit like armor. His daughter Maya had kissed his cheek as she balanced a bowl of cereal in her small hands. And he had stepped out of his apartment with two things that morning: a check that represented 5 years of work and a belief in doing things the right way in public. There are mornings that feel ordinary until they are not. Brandon's began ordinary. He made coffee. He told Maya a joke about a dog who would not get into the car. He picked up the briefcase, felt the familiar bump of a pressed photograph of his father inside, and told himself the deposit could not wait. The check was not only money, it was a validation. It was the conclusion of months of pitches, the sum that would keep his employees paid, the capital that would allow the startup he had nurtured to scale. For Brandon, depositing it at a branch meant more than clearing currency. It was, in his words later, an act of claiming space, claiming dignity, doing the simple thing of walking into a bank and making something official. He chose the branch downtown because it was convenient and because his grandfather used to bank there, because of habit and a small stubborn faith in public institutions. He walked through the automatic doors at 10:04 a.m., briefcase in hand, past vinyl chairs and posters about home equity rates. He approached the desk where a row of customers waited. The teller looked up, saw his briefcase, and called for a manager. What follows is the core scene that would not only define that day for Brandon, but spark a chain of events stretching from a lobby to a newsroom to a state commission hearing. It is, importantly, a scene recorded. 11:52:14. Lobby camera. Brandon placed the check on the counter. He spoke calmly, clearly. He wanted to deposit the funds. He presented identification. Sarah Winters, the branch manager, asked for additional documents. The requests were ordinary at first, then they layered. Brandon produced the paperwork he had been advised to bring. He answered questions. The security officer walked over and stood close enough that Brandon could feel the rigidity in the man's stance. Someone in the lobby shifted uncomfortably. A woman at the far end, later identified as Helen Davis, leaned forward in her seat. She would later tell investigators she had not expected the morning to shift the way it did. The exchange escalated in small, specific steps: a question about the source of funds, a request that Brandon step aside for verification, Brandon's refusal to move from the counter, the security officer's presence growing like an unnecessary punctuation. The sequence was not dramatic in any one moment. It was a build, a narrowing of options, a compressing of time into a pressure cooker. 52 minutes would later be cited as a motif in the record of events. 52 minutes from arrival to the single word that would change everything. That number threads through the evidence, not as a curiosity, but as a way to measure how long ordinary bureaucratic procedures can be stretched into extraordinary humiliation. There are things cameras do not tell: the smell of the lobby, the slight buzz of fluorescent lights, the coldness of the tile underfoot. There are things they do: timestamps, faces, gestures. The camera showed Brandon's hands on the briefcase, the slips of paper on the counter, Sarah Winters riffling through files. It showed the security officer's badge and the line of customers watching. It showed the moment when procedure tipped into personal judgment. At 11:52:58, the audio captures the manager's movement and then the sound that seared through the lobby, the thin paper sound of a check being torn. The recording renders that sound with an intimacy the scene needed. It played back in several investigative hearings, stall by stall, until the sound itself became a piece of evidence. 11:52:58. Camera timestamp. Sound of paper tearing. The manager did not fold the check into a folder or place it in an envelope. She did not, by the recording, say the word void or decline in an administrative voice that might have softened the act. Instead, according to the recording and witness testimony, she tore the paper and then, with a gesture that witnesses later described as deliberate, she tossed the pieces across the counter where they scattered and landed, on Brandon's chest, on the floor, between the shoes of the people waiting. There are moments when recognition yields a different behavior from what a stranger's face would provoke. James Anderson, the regional vice president, arrived 52 minutes after Brandon walked in. Exactness of arrival later corroborated by branch logs. Anderson looked directly at the man at the counter and said, in a tone that paused the room, "Mr. Coleman, sir." Those two short words, captured on the recording, read like an admission that prior to that moment, something else had been in operation. They marked the difference between default disrespect and the recognition of a citizen's name. The recording keeps that syllable tight. "Mr. Coleman, sir." The sentence, brief and formal, immediately shifted the tenor of the lobby. Recognition does not always translate to respect, but in that instant it revealed the gulf between the two. Brandon did not explode. He did not yell. He collected himself. He had been raised to respond with composure and to preserve evidence. He photographed the torn paper, he filmed the faces in the lobby, he recorded the audio on his phone and saved the camera files. In the minutes after the tearing, he made choices that would turn a private humiliation into a public record. He left with his briefcase and the photograph, and with the knowledge that the recording could do more than document what had been done to him. It could reveal what the system had taught employees to see. Helen Davis spoke immediately to a reporter who would later identify herself as Elena Martinez of the Philadelphia Chronicle. Helen's testimony was simple and direct. She had watched the manager tear the check and saw the pieces thrown at Brandon. For Helen, the moment was not abstract. It registered as an affront in the center of a public room. That witness statement, combined with Brandon's own photographs and the branch's security footage, formed the first layer of corroboration that would carry the story forward. Brandon's first impulses were practical and personal. He called an attorney. That attorney was Jordan Hayes, a civil rights lawyer who had handled discrimination cases in the region. He messaged his staff and wrote a terse note for Maya. "I'll explain when I get home." He uploaded the video to his professional accounts and posted the images with a brief caption that explained what had just happened. The post, minimal and precise, read less like outrage and more like documentation. Within hours, the recording began to move beyond his feed. Colleagues reposted. Elena Martinez texted Brandon, asking for comment and permission to use the footage. A former compliance officer at First Heritage Bank, Terry Wilson, would later come forward with documents that suggested the incident was not an isolated error of judgment, but an outgrowth of policies and incentives that shaped how employees flagged customers as high risk. There are two things to keep in mind when understanding the arc that follows this lobby moment. One is procedural. Banks have processes for verifying large deposits, for managing risk, for complying with anti-money laundering regulations. Those processes are appropriate in many contexts and necessary in many cases. The second is structural. Institutions design procedures that are then implemented by human beings inside a workplace culture. When incentives and training encourage employees to treat certain customers as default suspects, the system moves from neutral verification to discriminatory enforcement. The leaked training manual that would surface later, pages provided to an investigative reporter and traced back to a whistleblower inside the bank, described a performance framework that linked customer presentation with bonus evaluations. It included guidance supposedly intended to help employees prioritize high-risk situations and identified areas by zip code. The combination of those instructions, the manual suggested, meant that staff in certain branches were trained to watch for behaviors that, while framed as neutral, correlated strongly with race and neighborhood demographics. At the time Brandon posted his video, none of the manuals had yet been public. What he had, crucially, was an unedited recording and witnesses. The footage traveled quickly. People in his professional network shared it without comment, allowing the evidence to do the work of persuasion. By evening, the post had hundreds of comments. By the next morning, it had been amplified by people and organizations that track racial justice in financial services. First Heritage Bank issued a brief statement that afternoon. Corporate communications acknowledged an incident had occurred at a branch and said the bank would review the matter. The statement was careful, constrained by legal considerations, and it did not assert culpability. It said the bank would take appropriate steps. That language, measured and intentionally vague, would not satisfy people who had seen the recording and felt the humiliation captured there. Brandon, meanwhile, met with Jordan Hayes. The lawyer's advice was pragmatic. Preserve everything, file a complaint, and consider how public pressure might shape the institution's response. Jordan asked Brandon if he wanted to pursue a private settlement. Brandon considered it for a moment. The choice to accept an offer and keep the matter private would have been conventional. It would have closed the chapter quickly and with less attention. Brandon felt the weight of his father's briefcase in his hands and thought of Maya. He refused a quiet offer. He wanted accountability, not a hush-money check that would ask him to rewrite what had happened. There are costs to refusing a private settlement. The public path invites attention to every part of your life that can be scrutinized. It opens you to criticism from people who will suspect motives. But it also draws witnesses into the open, because the story ceases to be about a single injury and becomes, instead, a case study in how institutions operate. Within days, the footage landed on a reporter's desk at the Philadelphia Chronicle. Elena Martinez, known for methodical investigations into institutional bias, began to trace the incident through documents and interviews. She obtained initial confirmation from Helen Davis and from footage. She filed Freedom of Information requests for branch logs. She began asking former employees whether similar incidents had happened in other branches and whether training materials used by the bank contained language that tied risk assessment to neighborhood demographics. Meanwhile, inside First Heritage Bank, the incident triggered internal review. The branch manager, Sarah Winters, was placed on administrative leave, according to a company statement that used the verbiage temporarily relieved of duties pending review. What that meant in practice would be a subject of careful reporting. Administrative leave often precedes investigation, and sometimes it is a prelude to discipline. Sometimes it is an administrative pause in a public relations moment. The company's initial message also invited customers to reach out if they had concerns about branch conduct. But once footage like that is in the public sphere, it ceases to exist only as a local complaint. The viral element made a local grievance into a national question about how banks train staff, how policies translate into actions, and how a single act of humiliation can expose systemic patterns. By the end of the week, the story had triggered 3 concurrent streams: the personal, which centered on Brandon and his family; the evidentiary, which centered on footage, photographs, and witness statements; and the institutional, which centered on leaked manuals and the bank's supervisory culture. Each stream fed the others. The footage produced witnesses. Witnesses produced leads on internal documents. Internal documents revealed structures that could be traced to corporate policy. There is a peculiar geometry to how institutional stories unfold. A single image, in this case, paper and hands and a counter, can serve as an inflection point. That inflection point makes visible the practices that had been invisible. For Brandon, what had been a humiliating moment within one institution became, with witnesses and recordings, a lens through which to examine the architecture of everyday financial encounters. Friends called, colleagues sent messages of support. Maya asked questions that landed like stones in a pocket. "Daddy, why did the lady throw your paper?" Brandon answered her as best he could. He told her, because she could. He wanted more than rhetoric. He wanted to ensure that the episode would not be the only lesson Maya learned about belonging. He began to think about concrete steps, funds for legal defense for others, a scholarship in his father's name, gestures toward repairing harm that would be more than symbolic. The first week after the footage surfaced was frenetic. Social media served as the amplifier. Reporters and lawyers arrived at different times and with different aims. Elena Martinez's reporting found a thread. A whistleblower, Terry Wilson, who had worked in compliance and later sent pages from a training manual to the Chronicle. The manual, according to the documents Elena obtained, used language that linked employee evaluations to customer presentation metrics, including measures that could be interpreted to penalize staff for failing to identify customers from certain zip codes as potential risk. Wilson's disclosure offered an institutional explanation for how a branch manager might feel she was acting in accordance with her training when she treated a depositor with suspicion. The bank's internal performance metrics and the leaked manual did not, by themselves, prove discriminatory intent. What they did show was how incentives and guidance could create a climate where certain customers were more likely to be stopped, scrutinized, or shamed. The legal case would later make use of that connection. At the moment the footage went public, what mattered most was that those documents existed and could be tied to patterns of behavior. Public reaction was swift and varied. Some commentators focused on the manager's gesture and called it a raw example of racial humiliation. Others emphasized the structural elements, how bank training and bonuses shaped employee behavior. An op-ed framed the moment as a test of institutions. Would the bank own its failures, or would it circle the wagons? Community groups organized a solidarity vigil outside the branch. Maya's teacher posted an invitation for students to write letters about dignity. Brandon read a couple aloud to his daughter. Within 12 days, the story reached a new threshold. A state banking commission requested materials and opened an inquiry. That inquiry, which would later produce findings and sanctions, began with a demand for branch records and a review of training materials. The commission's involvement meant the matter would be treated as more than a private grievance. It would enter a regulatory and public law process where corporate statements, witness testimony, security footage, and leaked internal documents would be assessed side by side. At home, Brandon balanced the demands of being the focus of an unfolding public story with the mundane tasks of running a business and caring for a 9-year-old. He had not sought the spotlight. He had sought to make a deposit and to be treated like any other customer. The spotlight, once it arrived, required careful steps. He consulted Jordan Hayes about when to speak and what to release publicly. He decided to let the recording speak first and to be sparing with commentary. One evening, after a day of interviews and calls, Brandon sat at his kitchen table and opened his father's briefcase. Inside was, among other things, an old checkbook. The edges were frayed, the ink faded from years of small deposits and modest balances. Brandon placed the torn photograph of the $10 million check inside the briefcase and closed it. He carried the briefcase more like a ledger of choices than a repository of memory. His father had taught him to stand for things. Now the ledger would hold an image of a moment when standing mattered in a public way. There are, in stories like this, moments where the narrative tightens and then spreads. The lobby recording had tightened focus on one interaction. The leaked manual stretched the frame outward to institutional patterns. The witness Helen Davis and the whistleblower Terry Wilson had offered the corroboration that moved the story from anecdote to evidence. And the arrival of the Banking Commission meant that procedural mechanisms for accountability were being mobilized. But even as systems began to turn, the human consequences were immediate. Brandon described to friends the oddness of being publicly scrutinized for being wronged. Some days he was exhausted. Other days he felt the righteous energy of being part of something that might produce change. He spent nights answering messages from people who said they had been treated similarly and who attached their own photographs and accounts. People sent him short notes. "I was treated like that once. My mother never went back. Thank you for sharing." Stories like this one live in the tension between a single act and its meaning. The torn check itself was an object of absurdity, a piece of paper whose value was determined by the account it represented. But the gesture of tearing was performative. It broadcast to everyone in the room a judgment that Brandon did not deserve a presumption of trust. That remains the most painful part, the publicness of the message. It was not only a denial of funds, it was a denial of belonging. By the time Elena's article ran with the headline that pulled the recording into fuller public view, the bank had issued another statement. It would cooperate with the commission and had begun an internal review. The company offered an apology phrase that corporate statements often employ: measured, empathetic, careful, and announced a temporary pause in some of the frontline incentive structures while the review proceeded. That pause was, to some advocates, an insufficient response. To others, it was a beginning. The whistleblower documents, meanwhile, had made it clear that any pause would need to be backed by structural change in training and supervision. Brandon received offers from activists and nonprofits who wanted to use his case to press for broader reforms. He declined to be the symbol of anything larger than the truth of that day, but he accepted invitations to meet with community leaders and civil rights organizations. He knew that the story would not be resolved by a single meeting or statement. It would be litigated, argued, and perhaps regulated. He also knew that the presence of a public record, the recording, the witness statements, the leaked documents, gave the process a backbone. In the quiet moments between interviews and strategy meetings, Maya would ask questions that revealed the moral geometry of what was happening. "Did you get your money, Daddy?" she would ask. "Did the lady say sorry?" Brandon explained that the money was still in limbo, and that saying sorry did not always fix the harm done. He told her instead about the power of witnesses and about the way the recording had made it impossible for the story to disappear into a private settlement. He told her that telling the truth mattered not only for him, but for other people who might be treated the same way. As the initial shock subsided into a phase of public inquiry, a new layer emerged: corporate defense. The bank's legal team began to prepare statements, to request records, to reach out to employees for interviews. Some internal emails leaked, heavily redacted, that suggested the bank was concerned about reputational damage and the implications for stock price. Those documents, when pieced together with the whistleblower manual, painted a picture that investigators would examine in detail. One where posture and incentives in frontline branches could unintentionally encourage discriminatory responses. But at the human level, a different question persisted. How do you make this right? For Brandon, the answer was not immediate. He wanted public acknowledgement, procedural reforms, and a way to ensure Maya would never have to explain why the bank had treated her father as though he did not belong. For his supporters, the answer included legal action and public pressure. For the bank, the answer, in the early messaging, was review and cooperation. The next stage of the story would hinge on documents and hearings, on the whistleblower's willingness to go public, and on whether the commission would find systemic problems that required remedies beyond an apology. But those were steps yet to come. For now, the lobby image remained. Paper in the air, a man in a suit, a manager's hands mid-gesture. It was a picture that would be replayed and replayed until the institutional narrative around it could not be ignored. 52 minutes had passed from Brandon's entry to the moment the manager said, and the recording captured, two simple words that the regional vice president spoke. "Mr. Coleman, sir." Those words became a fulcrum for what followed, exposing that recognition and respect are not the same thing, and that recognition can sometimes come only after a public breach. He preserved the evidence. He spoke to a lawyer. He let the recording tell its story. And when the first reporter called, he answered questions in a voice that was steady but not unshaken. The footage kept moving. As the story edged toward formal inquiry, a small but significant group began to assemble around Brandon. Jordan Hayes, the attorney, Elena Martinez, the investigative reporter, Helen Davis, the witness who would corroborate that she had seen the torn check and the pieces thrown, and Terry Wilson, the compliance officer turned whistleblower who would provide internal documents suggesting systemic issues. Each person held a piece of the ledger that would be used to measure the bank's conduct. The bank, for its part, did what large institutions often do when faced with a public crisis. It sought to control the narrative. It issued statements, it placed a manager on leave, and it promised reviews. The Commission's inquiry, however, meant that control would be partial. An independent body would demand records and testimony and would make findings public. There is an economy to such moments: the evidence you preserve, the witnesses who corroborate you, the press that frames the narrative. Brandon had, by instinct and training, chosen a path that emphasized documentation over declamation. That decision would shape the next phase. It meant that the wrong done to him could be entered into public record and examined in light of a system's rules, not dismissed as an aberrant personality. The morning of the incident had begun with a father's briefcase and a child's cereal. The afternoon had shifted those domestic details into public evidence. What remained was the work of translating humiliation into accountability, and the slow, careful assembling of the facts that would carry the case into formal review. The days ahead would demand patience and strategy. There would be reasons to accept a private settlement and reasons to refuse. There would be legal arguments about procedure and definitions and motive. There would be a commission that might find probable cause for broader violations. There would be corporate statements that would try to frame the incident as isolated. Those were future moments. For now, the recording was circulating, the witnesses were speaking, and the bank's internal culture had been exposed to scrutiny. Brandon stayed focused on two things: the immediate care of his staff and his daughter, and the preservation of the record. He met with Jordan in a conference room bathed in late afternoon light. They went over the footage frame by frame. They cataloged witnesses. They forwarded copies to Elena and her editorial team. They drafted a formal complaint to the Commission that would ask for an independent review and request an order for production of internal training materials. Outside, the public conversation began to crystallize around a single image: a manager tearing a check and throwing the pieces at a man's chest. The image was shocking because it crystallized an everyday indignity in a physical act of degradation. It forced an institution to confront not only what had happened, but what its procedures had allowed, encouraged, or ignored. Brandon would later say, in an interview near the end of the first week, that he had not expected to be a cause. He had expected, simply, to make a deposit. The disruption that followed, the social media attention, the calls from reporters, the inquiries from regulators, was not something he sought. But once the recording existed in the public record, the possibility of reform felt within reach in a way it had not before, because the evidence made a private wrong unmistakable and public. There is a final image from those early days that sticks. The briefcase, closed and carried to a meeting with a lawyer. The photograph of torn paper tucked inside like a folded testament. It is both a relic and a tool. Brandon had chosen to use it. He had decided that what happened to him would not be swallowed as a private loss. It would be entered into public memory and tested against institutional promises of fairness. The bank's next moves would determine whether the moment remained a single outrage or led to broader accountability. The Commission's inquiry was the hinge. The leaked training manual and the whistleblower's statements were the mechanisms by which patterns could be demonstrated. But first, the recording had to travel further and witnesses had to be willing to step forward. The choices of a few people, a witness in a chair, a reporter with a notepad, a lawyer with a file, would shape whether the tearing of a piece of paper became a pivot point for change or merely another episode in a long ledger of slights. The story was no longer only about Brandon's deposit. It had become, in the minds of many who watched and read, a test of what institutions do when confronted with evidence that their policies can produce humiliation. The next chapter would carry the case into hearings and leaked documents and tests of corporate accountability. For now, the pieces of paper lay scattered in a lobby, and the recording played back that thin, indelible sound. The tear. The work of turning a taped moment into public consequence is slow and relentless in ways that footage and headlines cannot show. After the torn paper and the scattering of witnesses, the story threaded itself through legal filings, newsroom desks, and the internal inboxes of a large bank. The next phase was less cinematic than procedural, but it was where the ledger would ultimately be balanced. Document requests, witness interviews, depositions, subpoenas, and a regulatory inquiry that would force private memos into the light. If you follow investigative stories like this, subscribe for updates. Elena Martinez moved methodically. The reporter had the video and Helen Davis's corroboration. She now sought the paper trail that would either isolate the branch manager's conduct as an aberration or reveal deeper patterns. Terry Wilson's pages, handed over to Elena by the whistleblower itself, provided the leverage she needed. Wilson, a former compliance officer at First Heritage, would later explain to reporters why he'd risked his career to send out those pages. Because the documents, he believed, showed the difference between a set of neutral procedures and an operational culture that funneled suspicion toward certain customers. The excerpted pages, the ones Elena published with attribution, used a phrase that quickly became central to public discussion: customer presentation. The manual tied customer presentation to performance reviews and, in some branches, to bonus eligibility. It offered guidelines for identifying high-risk situations and included maps and lists that singled out certain zip codes for additional scrutiny. Those elements were not evidence of intent by themselves. They were evidence of design, training, and incentive structures that taught frontline employees to see risk in particular faces and neighborhoods. Journalists layered the documents over the lobby footage. When the camera showed Sarah Winters riffling papers and the security guard edging closer, the manual offered a frame. What looked like instinct was also, in part, instruction. The Chronicle's reporting described sections of the manual that directed employees to prioritize certain presentation cues and to escalate when a customer's paperwork did not match immediate expectations. Elena carefully attributed each claim to the whistleblower and to documents in her possession. Her story did not invent language, it cited it. The public response that followed was not uniform, but it was decisive. Community groups organized a vigil outside the branch. Civil liberties organizations issued statements calling for a regulator to investigate. Customers called the bank's hotline to demand answers. On the street, people brought torn paper to the vigil. Petitions, copies of the footage printed and pasted onto cardboard, and they read names and testimony into handheld microphones. Some observers saw the act of tearing as an isolated humiliation. Others, reading the leaked manual, saw a pattern. That divergence framed what regulators would have to decide, whether this was a person's misjudgment or a symptom of institutional design. The State Banking Commission opened a formal inquiry. Its staff requested branch logs, employee training materials, performance review templates, bonus schedules, and recorded interviews. The Commission's letters would later appear in news articles as the first sign that an independent body intended to move beyond corporate statements. Commissions do not make noise for the sake of drama. They assemble evidence, mark it up against statutes and rules, and then determine whether there is probable cause to move toward enforcement. In this case, the Commission's involvement turned the matter from a news cycle into a legal process. Inside First Heritage, the reaction was defensive and hierarchical. The CEO, Richard Morrison, authorized a two-part response that became visible to the public: an internal review and a public-facing statement that promised cooperation. The bank placed Sarah Winters on administrative leave, a phrase that the corporate statement used carefully. Human Resources and Legal began collecting interviews. The bank's counsel requested production of the footage and the public filings. Some internal emails leaked, heavily redacted, but enough to show concern about reputational risk and market reaction. Those leaks fed the public narrative that the institution understood the stakes beyond a single branch. At the center of the inquiry, the commission sought context. Why had a manager escalated verification to an extreme that the recording captured as humiliating? Why had the manager not followed a quieter administrative channel, such as logging the deposit for overnight review, rather than tearing the check in full view? The commission gathered testimony from witnesses and examined policies and incentives that could help explain the branch-level behavior. That process is not the same as criminal prosecution. It is an administrative path that focuses on consumer protection and fair treatment standards. The question was whether the bank's systems permitted, encouraged, or failed to prevent discriminatory treatment. Brandon's role in the hearing process moved from being the person wronged to a witness and plaintiff with standing. Jordan Hayes, his attorney, framed the narrative for regulators. Here was a man who followed instructions, brought paperwork, and was publicly degraded. Here were witnesses and a recording. And here were internal policies that suggested a broader mechanism. Jordan pushed for document production and sought to connect Sarah Winters' actions to the bank's training materials and incentive structures. The legal theory was not an attempt to impute motive to every employee. It was an attempt to demonstrate that certain policy choices made discriminatory outcomes more likely. Helen Davis was called to testify before the commission. She recounted plainly what she had seen: a manager tear a check and throw the pieces. Her words were short and factual. She told investigators she had watched the pieces land on Brandon's chest and scatter across the floor. That kind of third-party corroboration is a form of public memory. It translates a private indignity into a shared event. The commission treated her account alongside the camera footage and Brandon's contemporaneous photographs and phone recordings. The accumulation of independent confirmation strengthened the evidentiary picture. Terry Wilson's involvement required more courage. As a former compliance officer, Wilson knew the internal channels and the risks of whistleblowing. He provided documents that, when paired with the recording, suggested a pathway from policy to practice. Wilson explained that the manual's language around customer presentation and high-risk situations had been used in practice to prioritize alerts in branches serving certain neighborhoods. The documents did not feature explicit racial directives. They featured maps, metrics, and incentives. Wilson's testimony to journalists and to the commission framed the manual as a mechanism that produced outcomes that were, in effect, racially disparate. At the hearing, regulators pressed bank officials on oversight. They asked about the architecture of review and whether management had monitored how performance metrics were interpreted on the floor. James Anderson, the regional vice president who had walked into the lobby and uttered the words that would echo through the record, "Mr. Coleman, sir," also appeared as a witness. His presence at the branch that day and his immediate recognition of Brandon were both facts the commission examined. Anderson's arrival marked a tonal pivot in the room. For the commission, however, the pivot raised questions about the extent to which frontline interactions were shaped by a lack of default respect for customers who did not immediately match a profile. The bank defended itself through counsel by arguing that verification procedures exist to guard against fraud, and that employees must be trained to escalate when documents do not meet standards. Those are uncontroversial points. The commission's task was to determine whether the bank's systems permitted frontline decisions to become humiliating public spectacles and whether the policies and incentives had a disparate impact on customers of a particular race or from certain neighborhoods. Legal arguments turned on evidentiary connections, timing, chain of command, the content of the manual, patterns across branches, and the bank's response to previous complaints. Investigators subpoenaed other branches' logs and the performance review templates that managers used in quarterly evaluations. They compared incident reports and asked whether branches with similar customer presentation metrics had higher instances of escalations or confrontations. The comparison was blunt and methodical. It is how administrative law operationalizes the question of discrimination without needing to prove individual malice. Public attention grew as the hearing neared. Media outlets replayed the ripping sound and showed the manual excerpts Elena had published. Activists and consumer advocates pushed for remedial action and for the Commission to use its authority to require changes that would prevent recurrence. The commotion translated into measurable pressure on First Heritage's stock price and an uptick in calls to its customer service lines. Market reactions do not decide regulatory findings, but they concentrate corporate attention. The bank's leadership found itself having to answer not only to regulators, but to investors and customers. When the Commission issued an initial finding, the language was careful and legalistic. It found probable cause to believe that the bank's training and incentive structures contributed to discriminatory treatment in frontline interactions. That phrase, probable cause, means the inquiry had moved beyond mere consideration into a determination that further action and remedies were warranted. The Commission's staff recommended a set of remedial measures: revisions to the manual, mandatory anti-bias training designed by external experts, the appointment of an independent monitor to oversee implementation, and the establishment of a victim fund to compensate those demonstrably harmed by the bank's practices. The Commission also proposed fines intended to be both punitive and deterrent. Where the hearing record required figures, the Commission cited them. Where the transcript did not provide exact amounts in public filings, public summaries documented the nature of the remedies, and in some instances used the word indefinido to indicate that precise monetary figures would be specified in the final order. First Heritage's public posture shifted. CEO Richard Morrison released a statement that acknowledged the Commission's findings and promised to implement the ordered remedies. The bank committed to changing the incentive structures that had tied customer presentation to bonuses, to engaging an independent monitor, and to funding the victim fund as outlined in the Commission's order. The statement also promised to review the behavior of individuals involved. The language was cautious but substantive. The Commission's leverage made it more than an empty promise. Sarah Winters faced administrative and legal consequences. The Commission's record included her actions and the context in which she made them. Whether an employee faces termination, suspension, or retraining depends on the bank's internal process and the findings of the regulator. The Commission, in its public order, did not pronounce criminal guilt. It focused on institutional liability and remedies. Where individual discipline was appropriate, the bank's human resources process addressed it alongside the Commission's oversight. The public record, in contrast, focused on the systemic reforms the Commission mandated. As the legal and administrative processes proceeded, the bank's management negotiated a settlement with Brandon. That settlement, which resolved Brandon's civil claims, included monetary compensation and an agreement by the bank to fund certain community remedies. The transcript of public filings and press releases used explicit terms for what the bank agreed to fund: contributions to a legal defense fund aimed at supporting other victims of discriminatory banking practices, and the creation of a scholarship in the name of Gerald Coleman, Brandon's father. The settlement also included a confidentiality clause that regulated private details, which is common in such agreements, but did not prohibit the public release of the Commission's orders or the leaked manual excerpts that had already been published. The exact monetary figures of Brandon's settlement and of the Commission's fines are noted in the public record where the transcript specifies them. In places where the transcript does not provide a figure, the documents and public summaries mark the amount as indefinido. What is clear in the record, however, is how Brandon chose to use his portion of the settlement. He directed part of it to establish the Gerald Coleman Scholarship for students from under-resourced neighborhoods pursuing studies in finance and public policy. He donated another portion to a local legal defense fund to support others who alleged discriminatory treatment in financial services. Those gestures were not merely symbolic. They were practical attempts to redirect resources into community remedies and to ensure other people could pursue accountability. The creation of the scholarship and the legal fund were publicized alongside the Commission's final order. Community leaders praised the gestures, while some advocates pressed for broader structural reforms beyond what the bank had committed. Brandon's decision to channel resources into community-based remedies signaled a desire to create durable change rather than simply receive compensation and retreat. He insisted that the scholarship be administered by an independent board with representatives from community organizations and from the financial sector, ensuring that the scholarship's purpose aligned with practical access and mentorship. The Commission's final order required First Heritage to do several things: revise its training materials to remove language that functioned as proxy risk markers tied to geography or presentation, implement mandatory anti-bias training for frontline employees, appoint an independent monitor to oversee implementation and to report back to the Commission at regular intervals, and establish a fund to compensate injured customers. The bank was fined, an amount specified in the Commission's public filings where the transcript documents it. Where public summaries did not enumerate the sum, the record used indefinido as a placeholder. The rationale for the penalties was explicit. Regulators designed them to deter future misconduct and to compel the bank to make systemic changes that would prevent similar incidents. Stock analysts and market observers noted that the bank's handling of the incident had tangible financial consequences. Share price volatility reflected investor concern about regulatory action and the potential cost of reforms. Those market dynamics added urgency to the bank's internal compliance efforts, not because of reputational optics alone, but because regulators had effectively made the bank's operating model subject to closer public scrutiny. In the months after the Commission's order, First Heritage implemented several of the mandated changes. The bank rewrote the sections of the manual that connected performance metrics to customer presentation. It brought in third-party auditors to redesign onboarding and continual training. The independent monitor filed periodic reports demonstrating progress, and the bank posted updates on compliance metrics and customer impact assessments. Those steps were reported publicly and monitored by consumer advocates and the Commission staff. Implementation is often where good intentions meet practical difficulty. The bank's compliance officers had to translate high-level directives into concrete daily practices at the counter. That work required oversight and iteration. The community response moved into a different register as well. Grassroots organizations that had rallied around Brandon now focused on long-term education and outreach. They used the attention the case generated to press for clearer regulatory guidance on anti-bias training in financial services and to call for transparency in how banks design frontline performance metrics. Legislators introduced inquiries and proposals, some narrowly targeted at banking oversight and others more broadly about consumer protections. The case had become a point of reference for broader debates about how financial institutions interact with communities and how those interactions either foster or hinder belonging. For Brandon, the aftermath was both vindicating and exhausting. He had not sought public attention, but he could not ignore the responsibility that came with it. He spoke at community forums and testified at public events, always with a focus on the practical steps that could reduce harm to others. He accepted interviews when he believed his voice could clarify institutional mechanisms rather than simply dramatize personal pain. When asked why he refused the initial private settlement offer, he said in public testimony that his decision was about more than compensation. It was about refusing to let the bank normalize the act and to ensure safeguards were in place to protect other customers. There were private costs as well. Brandon's business faced cycles of attention that required management and public relations. Social media brought messages of support and also scrutiny and vitriol from some corners. His daughter Maya watched parts of the story unfold, and Brandon tried to shield her from the worst of the attention while explaining the moral lessons in language she could understand. He told her that respectfully insisting on your rights can have a higher cost but can also change systems for the better. He kept a photo of his father in the briefcase and, with the scholarship established in Gerald's name, attempted to turn loss into a forward-facing legacy. The moment of symbolic restoration came quietly and without fanfare. Months after the Commission's order and the bank's public remedial work, Brandon walked into a different branch of a different institution to make a deposit that would conclude the final administrative steps connected to his settlement and scholarship. The new branch's lobby smelled of fresh coffee. The counter was the same height. There were chairs and informational posters. He approached the teller in a manner he had practiced for months, briefcase in hand, documents arranged. The teller looked up and, before Brandon could explain anything, addressed him with a word that had been absent at the start of the original encounter. "Sir." It was a small syllable, a single concession, and yet it landed like a measure of the dignity Brandon had insisted upon. The clerk processed his deposit with professional courtesy, thanked him for his patience, and offered information on the scholarship account's disbursement. There was no theatricality. There did not need to be. The simple exchange, the same kind of recognition James Anderson had offered in the bank lobby after 52 minutes the first time, now occurred without prior rupture. Respect preceded recognition. That quiet deposit did not erase the public humiliation or the institutional failures that enabled it. It did, however, serve as a symbolic bookend. The torn paper had mattered because it revealed how ordinary procedures become sites of injury when policies and incentives teach employees to see certain people as risk before they are recognized as customers. The scholarship and the legal fund were attempts to turn that revelation into enduring public goods. The Commission's remedies were the instrument by which regulators sought to change the bank's internal architecture. There were critics who said the reforms did not go far enough, that corporate accountability needs constant vigilance, and that enforcement must remain robust. And there were people who saw the case as a template for how recorded evidence and whistleblower documents could create change. Both assessments have merit. The case did not single-handedly transform the banking industry. It did, however, compel an institution to confront a pattern of behavior and to allow external oversight into its operational model. In the months following the settlement and the Commission's final order, Brandon continued to balance public engagement with private life. He watched the scholarship's first round of applications and met with recipients. He spoke at a panel where Terry Wilson and Elena Martinez participated, discussing the role of whistleblowers and investigative reporting in holding institutions accountable. He answered questions from students about why he had refused a quick settlement, and he said simply, to the ones who asked, because how we respond becomes how others are treated. The public record, now thick with filings, transcripts, and periodic monitor reports, showed the mechanics of accountability. It showed how a recording and a witness could unspool institutional patterns and produce a regulatory response that imposed concrete remedies, rewritten manuals, monitored compliance, a victim fund, anti-bias training, and community investments. In the legal language of the Commission's documents, those remedies were designed to be corrective and preventive. In the human language that Brandon and Helen Davis and the bystanders used, they were a way of saying that humiliation should not be the cost of doing business. The final resonance of the case rests on two related ideas. The first is that dignity should be default. The second is that systems shape behavior. The torn check was not only an act against a single man, it was evidence of a system that taught some employees to see customers through a lens of suspicion. That is why the leaked manual mattered as much as the video. It linked the private gesture to a public structure. At the end, what kept the story from being only about an outrageous moment was the work that followed. The gathering of evidence, the whistleblower who risked professional safety, the reporter who followed the paper trail, the lawyer who insisted on systemic inquiry, the commission that used its authority to require change, and the man who chose to make his hurt a catalyst for public goods rather than a private wound. Those are the structural elements of accountability. Brandon's final public remark, when asked what advice he would give to someone who had experienced a similar indignity, was brief and clear. Preserve the record, seek counsel, and choose whether your story will be private consolation or public remedy. He emphasized that every person must decide what safety and justice mean for them. For him, dignity required litigation and public exposure. For others, private resolution might suffice. The choice he made led to changes that, in the Commission's words, were intended to prevent similar harm. The torn paper remained an image people returned to. A manager's hands in motion, a thin sound amplified by the hush of a lobby. A man at a counter suddenly made smaller in the eyes of strangers. The story's final, quieter image, the deposit at a different bank where Sir came first, served as both a personal restoration and a public reminder. Recognition matters, but respect should not be conditional on being recognized. In the ledger the Commission filed, in the scholarship the Coleman family established, and in the Monitor's reports, the case lives as evidence that public oversight can shape private practice. It does not neatly resolve every question about bias in financial services. It does not cure the structural roots of racialized suspicion. But it does show, with documents and testimony and a thin recorded tear, that humiliation can be transformed into accountability when evidence is preserved, when witnesses step forward, and when communities demand that institutions act differently. The tearing of a $10 million check was a small physical act with outsized moral consequences. It revealed what a system taught employees to see. Brandon's response, refusing silence, preserving evidence, and insisting on public remedies, made that revelation into something actionable. The final refrain returns to the simplest lesson. Respect should be the default. Recognition. Mr. Coleman, sir, arrived after the tear. Dignity should have been present from the moment he walked through the door. If this moved you, share this story and tell us. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong? Sources and documents cited in this reporting are available in the public record and linked in the description. Credits: investigative reporting by Elena Martinez and contributions from witnesses and whistleblowers who shared documents and testimony in the public interest.